Ralph, what was your take?
There's a sort of unrealistic aspect to the conversation around the deficit. We don't talk about financing two wars off the books. We haven't gotten our arms around spiraling healthcare costs, the growing cost of debt service, and a historic tax cut that failed to do what it promised, and that is to stimulate the economy. These things are put aside, and then we pretend as if the deficit just happened. The course we've been on has been unsustainable for at least a decade, and anybody who's listened to Gene Sterling talk about the two Santa Claus policy knows that. So where we are today is some mix of medicines that none of us are really going to like. And I don't envy the Deficit Commission in trying to chart a course that's going to set out a set of provisions which will require raising some revenue, cutting some programs, curbing others, and really trying to see if we could right-size the budget and get us heading in the right direction. I do believe that as I look at some of the proposals around Social Security, I might want to do more on the revenue side and not as much on the constraints, but I think overall my view is the Deficit Commission got the public conversation started in the right direction. The ultimate test, and I'm from the Casey Foundation, the ultimate test is, are we going to do right by the children upon whom we defend to do right by all of us? And that's a test that has yet to be applied and a test that's yet to be passed.
Gene, I think you're obligated to tell us about the two Santa Claus theory here.
Well, it's interesting. This goes way back historically, but around the mid-'70s, a number of Republicans felt that they were sort of a persecuted, misunderstood class, and that the Democrats essentially were able to be Santa Claus and they had to play Scrooge. So the Democrats would enact expenditure increases, and the Republicans, being good deficit hawks, would enact tax increases to finally balance the budget. And the only reward they got is more spending increases. Jude Wanniski is actually the person who came up with the term two Santa Claus policy. He worked for the Wall Street Journal editorial pages. You might know of him. And he put out an article called The Two Santa Claus Policy. And essentially what he argued is Republicans need to be Santa Claus too. We can no longer be Scrooge. We need to have tax cuts we don't pay for either. And then that way, hopefully, the Democrats will have to enact eventually these spending cuts that get us back into balance. Now, he also had a host of pie-side theory on why tax cuts would pay for themselves. I won't go into that. But the point of it is actually we got the two Santa Claus policy. So that both parties now essentially say we can enact spending increases and not pay for them. We can enact tax cuts and not pay for them. We've gone through, I'd say, at least 10 or 15 years now where we've been in a two Santa Claus policy. Now, we have reasons we want to be there, too. We've had a war and a terrorist attack and two recessions, and the last one being a big one. So we have all these reasons why we don't have to pay for what we're doing. But those are political arguments. Essentially, everything government does is a balance sheet. Everything you do here, we're going to pay for now or pay for later. In fact, I object to taking any tax cut or any spending increase and just distributing the benefits across who gets those benefits, because if we pay for it with a deficit, that's just a set of burdens where we haven't identified who's going to pay. And by the way, it's largely the next generations, our children and grandchildren. Can I make one other quick comment, too, on the debt commission? I'm very positive about what they did because they've reframed the debate. They're saying, okay, we have this unsustainable system, and we're debating losers off of getting that system back to sustainability. Let's reframe the debate. Let's take a sustainable system, and now let's debate how we reform it. And so the comments that John, Ralph, and I might make, and I have a number of amendments I would make, too, how I would go off of that reframed debate, but I'd rather argue off of a sustainable system and how I'd reframe it than an unsustainable one.
So the immediate issue in terms of looking at this as a matter of family and having to, it's the government budget, but in some way it's a family budget. And in terms of Generations United, we're talking about how the family sitting at the kitchen table makes decisions here. So, John, as we're in the immediate sense looking at this, and with the lame duck session of Congress coming, we're talking about whether or not to extend the Bush tax cuts, and whether or not it should be extended for all, whether it should be extended for some. How does that argument fit in to this conversation that we're having this morning about trying to make sure that the family, and especially poor families, have sufficient income so that nobody, young or old, is suffering?
Well, I'd just make 2 points. One is, traditionally, politics is about the tension between the haves and have-nots. Not about young and old, but about the haves and the have-nots. And that's certainly true when we get to tax policy. We have record levels of income inequality in the United States. We have, for most people, flat wage income over the last 20 years. But for Wall Street, it's gone through the roof. We could use the tax code to address some of that, and I think it would be positive. Instead, we're having a debate to give those people a free ride, which I find incredible. So I think that is one comment. And the other comment is, you know, we do have a weak economy, and this is not job number one is to get the economy back, get jobs back. And I think that when we talk about the tax code, then timing is important. And so I want to recognize that. But on the other hand, we're not, as Gene said earlier, we're not collecting anywhere near enough revenue to balance what we're spending. And in terms of investments in the future, we have to have a better balance between the revenue that comes in and the spending decisions and investment decisions that we make. So we do need broader tax reform. I don't see that happening in the lame duck. I think this is a job for the next Congress.
So it just gets pushed down the road. But essentially what I hear you saying is you are opposed to extending the Bush tax cuts.
Well, I don't think AARP is going to take an issue on the tax cuts. I just find in terms of the income inequality in this country, in terms of the real political conflict between haves and have-nots, and we're here, you know, basically on the part of the have-nots, I find it amazing that there isn't more of that kind of discussion in public about who is in a position to contribute more fully to the joint problems that we all face.
Well, let me just anticipate that question. The Casey Foundation has no position on the tax cut. Let me be clear about that. Having put the Casey Foundation aside, you know, let me tell you, we are results oriented. We say we're results driven. So the question I have to ask: how many people think that the tax cuts did what they were supposed to do? I don't see any hands. And I ask that question all the time, and nobody puts their hand up so that those tax cuts did what they're supposed to. So my sense, if it's not producing the result you want, get rid of it. Now, that's a personal position, not one that I want attributed to the Casey Foundation. The Earned Income Tax Credit, however, the Earned Income Tax Credit has done exactly what we had hoped it would do. And the Earned Income Tax Credit has lifted more families out of poverty than any single social policy. The Earned Income Tax Credit added to, and Beth, your point about Social Security was really wonderful. You take the Earned Income Tax Credit and you take the survivors' benefits for Social Security. You take the number of the 3 million kids who are getting survivors' benefits and 2 million kids who live in households that get Social Security. You put those two together, they do what they're supposed to do, and they should be kept. My sense is maybe we ought to have a less ideological and more pragmatic standard. If it works, keep it and do more. If it doesn't work, get rid of it and do something different. And I would hope that somebody says that through this debate over the next few weeks.
Gene?
Just as a footnote to that, the Earned Income Tax Credit is at best indexed for inflation. The child credit, which is sometimes associated with that, is scheduled to decline. It's not even indexed for inflation. So these are among the many programs for children actually that are scheduled already to decline. And I think that's one of the things we have to face in this budget context is some groups, in some sense, are already contributing to deficit reduction and others are not. And so we want to look through those numbers. And I would say programs for children are especially vulnerable. We just have to add that. And we hope that the elderly and the middle age will join in that debate. I should also add that programs for the elderly, for the most part, will not be affected usually that much by debt reduction. There's some effects. There's might be through Medicare. There's some that talks about a consumer price adjustment slightly. But for the most part, the current elderly are out of the system too. That is, we basically say you're already in, your Social Security benefits are intact, your Medicare benefits are intact. So it's basically the middle age who we really are talking to the most, because they're the ones who, at least in the next 10 or 20 years, are going to basically bear the burden of getting this system back into order, either through tax increases or through spending cuts. And so in some ways, when we pose this Generations United issue as elderly versus the young, it's a little silly. The young aren't voting, and they're already scheduled to have the cuts. The elderly probably aren't going to be affected that much. It's the middle-aged who largely are faced with this dilemma, okay, how are we going to reform the system to make it better for all of us?
John?
Well, I think we don't advocate just for current older people. Our mission is to improve the quality of life for all Americans as they age, and that certainly includes middle-aged people who are looking forward to a retirement that could be in jeopardy now, and not just from deficit reduction, but from out-of-control health costs, for example, or from what's happening in the housing market or Wall Street. I mean, there's a lot of risk out there facing people trying to make plans for their future. And so I think we have to take all that into account.
We have time now for questions from the audience. So I'd ask you to think about it and just stand up, tell us where you're from, and ask a question. But Ralph, I sensed you wanted to say something before we start the questions from the audience.
This is why he's such a great moderator, you know. I think the report, it really invites us to reframe the debate and come back to the intergenerational compact. And in many respects, even with the proposals of the Deficit Reduction Commission, we're going to pass on to our children and grandchildren a fairly substantial debt. And in addition to passing on that debt, maybe the intergenerational compact requires us to pass on value with that debt, and that value might take the form of a nation that's strong and safe and secure, of a commitment to make sure that our kids and grandkids have air they can breathe and water they can drink, to make sure that they have an education system that actually allows them to develop human capital and is not an embarrassment in the industrialized world. And that along with that we solve the big crushing problems like healthcare and poverty, and not pass on to them and duck to them the responsibility we have for dealing with the big problems, and better position them to actually deal with that. Maybe that's the real intergenerational compact, and to some extent we're being distracted from that by these divisive arguments that pit children against seniors, as if that's really the case. That is not what is at issue here. It's rather all of us can come together across generations and do what needs to be done for our kids and grandkids. That, it feels to me, is the real challenge and the real value and the inspiration of this report that you've produced here today.
Well, I've been told we have no time left, but I'm going to just allow one question. So if somebody has a dying to ask a question, please do right now. Well, it looks like nobody's dying to ask a question.
See that?
So please join me in thanking our panelists.